What would you do if everything you had left in the world, every last dollar, bought you nothing but 12 sick, dying animals that the whole town laughed at? For Nora Calloway, 23 years old and widowed less than a month, this wasn't a question. It was the only door left open. 12 goats, worm-bellied and hollow-flanked, sold off the estate of a dead stranger for $300, every cent of her settlement. The men at the auction laughed out loud when she raised her hand. But beneath the floorboards of the battered milk wagon that came with those goats waited a secret that had been buried for 6 years, a secret that would fill her barn, break a powerful man, and bring dairy farmers from 3 counties to her gate. Settle in, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. To understand why a young widow would spend her last $300 on 12 dying goats, you have to understand where Nora learned to look at an animal. She was born Nora Whitfield, up in the high pasture country above Marble Hollow, the only child of Amos Whitfield, a goatherd and cheesemaker whose small white wheels of aged Tommy won ribbons at the county fair 9 years running. Her mother died of a fever when Nora was 4, and after that it was just the 2 of them, Amos and the girl, in a stone cabin with 40 goats and a copper kettle and a cellar that smelled of salt and thyme. Amos taught her the way some fathers teach scripture. He taught her that a goat tells you the truth with her body long before she tells you with her voice. He taught her to read the pink inside a lower eyelid. Pale meant worms, red meant health. He taught her that mastitis announced itself in the first hot, hard quarter of the udder, and that you caught it at dawn or you lost the dough by winter. He taught her to strip the first streams of milk onto the back of his old tin cup and study them for clots, and to know butterfat by the way the cream rose in the pan, slow and thick as poured honey. He taught her to trim a hoof flat and true, to drench a sick animal slow so the medicine went down and not into the lungs, to move among nervous stock with your breathing quiet and your hands low. A goat's not a machine, girl, he used to say, working the bellows of his small forge where he repaired his own tools. She's a ledger that walks. Everything you put into her, feed, patience, gentleness, it all comes back to you in the pail. Cheat her, and the milk knows. When Nora was 9, Amos forged her a gift, a small brass bell, no bigger than a walnut, with her initial worked into the metal, a single curled N. He hung it on a braided leather cord. For your first lead doe someday, he said. A herd follows a bell. She never owned a lead doe while he lived, but she wore the bell around her neck every day for 14 years, tucked beneath her collar, warm against her skin. She married Thomas Calloway at 21, a quiet quarryman with good hands, and her father danced at the wedding with his boots polished and his eyes wet. 8 months later, in the spring of 1893, the fever came down the valley and took Amos Whitfield in 4 days. And then, as if grief were a thing that travelled in pairs, a fall of stone at the Marble Mount quarry took Thomas before the summer was out. In the space of 1 season, Nora buried every person who had ever loved her. Would you have had anything left to spend after that? Let us know in the comments what you think you'd have done. Thomas Calloway had an older brother named Silas. Silas kept accounts for the quarry company, and he looked at the whole world the way he looked at his ledgers, as a column of entries to be balanced and closed. He came to Nora's rented rooms 9 days after the funeral wearing a clean collar and carrying a leather portfolio, and he sat across the kitchen table from her and opened his books as though he were reading the minutes of a meeting. The estate, Silas said, is not complicated, but it is not generous. He turned a page. Thomas carried a debt of $160 against the company store. There are doctor's fees of $31. Funeral costs, $75. The rent on these rooms is paid through the month. He made a small mark with his pencil. Against the sum owed you from his wages and the sale of the furniture, which I have taken the liberty of arranging, the estate yields a final settlement of $300. $300. He counted it out onto the oilcloth in bills, and then he did something Nora would remember longer than the number itself. He placed the empty ledger between them like a closed door and said, "I would advise you to take a position in service, Mrs. Calloway. There are respectable houses in Altona that take widows." And then, with the pencil still in his hand, he added, "This account is now settled." Nora did not argue. She had learned from her father that you do not argue with weather. The next morning she packed 1 canvas bag, 2 dresses, her father's milking apron with a copper kettle worked into the hem, his tin stripping cup, his hoof knife and trimming shears wrapped in oiled cloth, 1 photograph of Amos standing among his goats, a wool blanket, and Thomas's pocket watch, which no longer ran. At the very bottom of the bag, where it lay against her heart when she carried it, she placed the little brass bell with the curled N. She had $300, one bag, and no destination. And here is where any sensible person would have taken the train east toward those respectable houses in Altoona. Nora went the other way. She went by stagecoach up into the high country, because high pasture was the only country that had ever felt like home, and because there was a notice nailed up at the Marble Hollow depot that she had read 3 times while waiting for her trunk to be sold. No shouting. No cruelty you could point to. Just a young woman converted, line by line, into a closed account. Estate auction, Elias Marrow, deceased. Stock, implements, wagon, effects. Saturday. Everyone in Marble Hollow knew about Elias Marrow, or thought they did. He had been the strange old man on the ridge farm, a breeder of dairy goats once, decades back, and by some old accounts a good one, though nobody could quite remember when they'd last seen an animal on his place that looked like anything but bones and burrs. He had died alone in February and been found by the roadman in March, and the county had waited through spring for an heir who never came. Now his creditors would take what the auction brought, and what didn't sell would be turned out or shot. The morning of the sale was grey and spitting rain. Maybe 30 men stood around the pen with their collars up. The driver who'd carried Nora up from the depot, a kind-faced man named Hoke, leaned on the rail beside her and shook his head at what was inside it. 12 goats. And goats is a generous word for what stood in that mud. They were hollow in the flank and rough in the coat, hips like the corners of a table, every one of them. Several coughed. 2 stood hunched with the dull, dropped look of animals carrying a heavy worm load. An old doe in the corner favored a front foot gone wrong with rot. The auctioneer, a fair-minded man named Dill, walked the rail and said to no one in particular, and to Nora in particular, "Miss, I'll tell you plain what I told the creditors, half of these won't see the first snow. You'd do better with a sound milch cow." "I thank you for the honesty," Nora said. She was looking at their eyes. Not the eyes of the goats, their eyelids. She had walked the pen slow, the way Amos taught her, and pulled down each lower lid with a thumb. Pale. Pale as paper, most of them. Worms, yes. But worms can be drenched. And under the burrs and the ruin she was seeing something else, something in the clean straight level of the backs, the wide-sprung ribs, the high tight udder attachments on the does, the dairy wedge of them, lean at the front and deep at the rear. Whoever had built these animals, long ago, had known exactly what he was building. The bidding opened at $1 a head as a joke, and the men laughed, and the joke died when Nora said, "I'll give $300 for the 12, with the wagon and harness and what's in the barn." There is a particular silence that falls when a room full of men decides a woman has gone mad. Dill the auctioneer cleared his throat. "Mrs. Calloway, the sum is the whole of—" "It is the whole of what I have," she said. 300. A big man at the back of the crowd, she would learn his name soon enough, Harlan Dace, who owned the Marble Hollow Creamery and half the mortgages in the valley, pushed his hat back and studied her the way you'd study a strange entry in a ledger. Then he smiled, and it was not a kind smile. "Let her have them," Dace said. "Some folks need to buy their lessons." The hammer fell. 12 dying goats, 1 sway-backed milk wagon, a harness stiff as bark, and a barn's worth of rusted implements. $300. Settled. And do you know what the strangest thing at that whole auction was? An old woman standing apart at the fence line, wrapped in a man's wool coat, watching Nora count out the bills. When the sale was done, the old woman came past her, slow, and said one sentence without stopping, without even looking at her directly. "Elias always said the milk remembers. Said the herd would outlive the man, if it could just find patient hands." Then she walked on down the road, and Nora stood there in the spitting rain with 12 dying goats and no idea what the woman meant. She had no farm. What she had was a wagon, and the wagon led her to the rest. The county roadman told her that old Elias's ridge place was under claim by the creditors and closed to her, but 2 miles down the hollow sat the Bryce farm, 40 acres of briar and lean-to buildings that had stood empty since Corwin Bryce died, and his widow Adeline now kept rooms in town and had no use for it. Adeline Bryce was a square, quiet woman of 60 with flour permanently in the creases of her knuckles, and she looked at Nora's 12 skeletons tied to the wagon and said, $2 a month, and I'll not pretend it's charity, because the place is worth about that. Water's good. Roof mostly holds. I'll take it, said Nora, and that was that. The first month nearly finished her. She slept in the barn loft because the house smelled of mice and sorrow, and she rose before light every morning and worked until her hands stopped feeling like hers. She drenched all 12 goats against worms, Twice, 14 days apart, the way Amos had drummed into her, and trimmed 12 sets of overgrown hooves with her father's shears, and doctored the old doe's rotten foot with carbolic and clean wrapping until the animal put weight on it again. She cut briars until her forearms were cross-hatched with scratches. She carried water. She rubbed oil into the stiff harness and caulked the wagon seams and scrubbed years of filth out of the lean-to that would be her milking shed, and at night she lay in the loft listening to 12 animals cough and wondered if Harlan Dace had been right about lessons. Her hands changed. The softness went out of them and the callus came in, and the muscles of her forearms stood up like the muscles of her father's forearms, and there was a morning in her 5th week when she looked at her own grip around a water bucket and saw Amos Whitfield's hand instead of hers, and had to sit down in the straw for a minute. She did not cry. She rarely cried. She sat a minute, and then she got up, because the animals do not wait for grief. And still, she lost 2 of them. A doeling too far gone to save, and then an old wether whose heart simply gave out. She buried them at the fence line and stood there in the cold and did the arithmetic of her failure. $300, 12 goats, 10 goats, and winter coming down the hollow like a slow grey wave. If the does weren't healthy enough to breed by the first hard snow, there would be no spring kids. No kids, no milk. No milk, no Nora Calloway in Marble Hollow past Christmas. She was losing. She knew it, and the town knew it. Boys drove past the Bryce place on Sunday just to look at the widow's skeletons and laugh. Have you ever had a season where the work was winning and you were losing? Tell me about it in the comments. I read every one. And if these stories of quiet, stubborn people are the kind you settle in for, subscribe and stay a while. There's more where this came from. The turn, when it came the way Amos had always said it would, through the animals telling the truth with their bodies. It was the 2nd week of her drenching and nursing and good feed, and the goats had begun to change. Their coats were still rough but their eyes had come up bright, and the eyelids were pinking, worms on the run. The old doe with the rotten foot, a deep red animal Nora had named Sorrel, had taken to following her around the pasture like a dog, and it was Sorrel who found the first thing Nora couldn't explain. The Bryce place had no barn fit for kidding, so Nora had taken to wintering the herd in the old lean-to, and she'd hauled the Marrow wagon inside it to get the bed out of the weather. And twice now she'd come out at dawn to find Sorrel standing on the wagon's lowered tailgate, 4 feet up on the bed, sniffing at one particular corner of the floorboards with the fixed, trembling interest a goat gives to something that matters. A goat's nose doesn't lie. That's not sentiment, that's husbandry. Nora climbed up and ran her hands over the boards of the wagon bed, and at first they told her nothing. Then her fingers, which were her father's fingers now, found it. The grain was wrong. You have to understand that wagon beds are built of planks laid long, end to end, and the grain of every plank runs with the road. But in the rear corner of this bed, where Sorrel kept sniffing, there was a square of wood, maybe 2 feet on a side, whose grain ran across. And the moss. Along the seam of that square, in a wagon kept dry inside a lean-to, a thin bright line of moss had rooted itself, the way moss roots where damp rises from below and air moves through a gap that shouldn't exist. She stood there a long moment, and her father's voice came back to her across 4 years and a grave, clear as if he'd spoken from the tailgate. Wood remembers, girl. Where the grain runs wrong, a hand has been there before you. Someone had opened this floor once. Someone had built something beneath it. She went to work that same hour, and this is where I want you to slow down with me, because what Nora Calloway did next was not luck. It was craft, the exact craft her father had spent 14 years putting into her hands. She began with her eyes, not her tools. Amos had taught her that you never strike what you haven't read. She cleared the wagon bed of bedding and swept it with her bare palm, and she read the fastenings. The square was held not with nails but with screws, old slotted screws, countersunk and painted over a dozen times, which is why no eye had ever caught them. Screws meant the builder intended the space to be opened again. Nails mean closed forever. Screws mean closed for now. Her own toolkit held nothing fine enough, so she walked the 2 miles into town and traded an hour of hoof trimming on the blacksmith's drove mules for the loan of a long driver and a thin pry bar. The smith, a broad young man named Cole Burlow, asked what she was prying, and she said, "A question," and he let that stand. Men like Cole respect work more than answers. Back in the lean-to, she set the driver's edge to the first screw head and pressed, slow and even, the way you press on a hoof before you cut, feeling for the give. The paint cracked. The screw turned. 14 screws, she counted, and every one of them came out clean, because the man who set them had greased them first. Whoever he was he had loved this wagon. 14 greased screws in a hidden panel. Write that down in your mind, because it tells you everything about what was coming. She worked the thin bar into the seam and lifted, and the square of floor rose on old leather hinges, oiled and silent, and the smell that came up out of the dark beneath was dry and sweet, the smell of cedar and old paper and time kept safe from the weather. Nora Calloway sat back on her heels in the straw, with the light coming through the lean-to slats in long bars, and looked into the hollow beneath the wagon bed. What do you think she found down there? Tell me in the comments before you watch on. I promise the truth is better than your guess. The hidden space was a cedar-lined chest built between the wagon's frame rails, as long as the bed and a foot deep, and it had been packed by a person who expected to be a long time gone. She took the contents out one at a time and laid them on a clean feed sack, and here is the inventory exactly as she made it, because the exactness matters. A canvas-wrapped packet of banknotes and gold coin, which she counted twice with shaking hands and which came to $487. A stud book, a thick ledger bound in calfskin, its pages covered in a fine, sloping hand, recording the pedigree of a herd of dairy goats across 31 years. Births, breedings, milk yields measured to the half-pint, butterfat tests, show placings from fairs as far away as Harrisburg. On the first page, in that same hand, the Marrow herd. Founded 1856. Bred for the pail, not the ring. A wooden box containing 31 ribbons, most of them faded, all of them first prize. A daguerreotype of a young couple standing before a new painted barn, the man tall and raw-boned, the woman small and smiling, a white goat between them. A child's carved wooden goat, no bigger than a thimble, painted red, the paint worn soft where small fingers had held it. And a letter. Sealed with red wax, thick as a pamphlet, and addressed in that same fine hand to no one and everyone. To whoever finds this. Nora read it twice through in the failing light, and then, because a letter like this deserves to be read aloud at least once in this world, she read it a third time, slow, to sorrel the red doe and the gathering dusk. This is what it said. To whoever finds this, my name is Elias Marrow, and if you have found this wagon floor, then you have found the last of my herd, and so I know two things about you already, that you can see worth where others see bones, and that you are patient enough to follow a thing to its end. Those are the only two qualifications I require, so listen well. In 1856 my wife June and I founded this herd from 6 dozen a dream, and for 30 years we bred them for the pail, for milk so rich the creamery men said it must be doctored. It was not doctored. It was bred, generation on generation, and the secret of it is in this book, which is worth more than the money, though God knows I did not understand that until the end. In 1884 June and our daughter Rose died of the diphtheria within 1 week of each other. Rose was 9. She carved the little goat you may have found here, or rather she carried it until it wore smooth. When I buried them I was not in my right mind, and while I was gone from myself, my partner, I will not write his name, the valley knows it, sold my best 60 head out from under me, told the creamery my milk was fevered, and broke the herd that June and I had built with our 2 pairs of hands. By the time I came back to myself, the Marrow herd existed nowhere on this earth except in these pages and in the 12 animals I managed to hide and keep, the last true blood of the line. I have kept them as well as a grieving old man can. They are the herd now. Whoever you are the herd now. The money is yours, honestly come by. I sold timber, not goats, and I lived on little. The book is yours, and it is the real inheritance. In return I ask one thing only, do not sell the blood to be crossed out and scattered. Breed them true. Bring the line back. Make these hills white with them again, the way they were when June stood in the pasture at evening and called them home by name. The milk remembers, whoever you are. Men forget, and ledger men most of all. But the milk remembers. E.M., November 1887. 6 years. The letter had waited 6 years under the floorboards for hands patient enough to find it. Nora folded it along its creases and sat very still in the dark of the lean-to, with $487 and a stud book and a child's red goat laid out on a feed sack, and outside in the pen 10 goats shifted and breathed, 10 animals that were not a mistake, not a madness, not a widow's folly. The last true blood of the Marrow herd. She thought of Harlan Dace's smile at the auction. Let her have them. Some folks need to buy their lessons. She wondered if Dace had been at that sale in 1884. She wondered if the valley knew his name the way Elias said it did. She was beginning to suspect it did. Now here is the moment where this story could have gone the ordinary way. A young widow finds hidden money, $487 was more than a year's wages for a working man, and she takes the train east and buys a good coat, and the goats are somebody else's problem. Nobody in Marble Hollow would have blamed her. Some stories you already know end exactly there. But you have to remember what was at the bottom of Nora's canvas bag, against her heart, a brass bell with a curled N, forged for her by a man who said a herd follows a bell. And now she held a stud book from another man, a man she had never met, who had lost more than she had, telling her the herd was hers. 2 dead men, 2 gifts. She knew what her father would have called that. He would have called it a trust. So she made her choice, and she made it quietly, the way she did everything. She would not leave. She would winter the herd, breed them true by the book, and bring the Marrow line back, and she would do it in full view of every man who had laughed at the auction pen. That is when Marble Hollow began, one small transaction at a time, to change its mind. It started with Tobias Finch, the carpenter, a widower who spoke about 10 words a week. He drove out one morning without being asked, examined the lean-to roof, and spent a day replacing the rotten valley boards. When Nora asked what she owed, he said, "You trimmed my mare's feet in the spring and didn't charge. Now we're square," and he said it in a tone that closed the subject. Then, at the gate, he added his 11th word of the day, kidding stalls. "You'll want 3. And he built those 2. It continued with Adeline Bryce, who began arriving on Saturdays with a basket, bread, a crock of beans, once a pie, and who would set it down and say leftover in a voice that forbade argument, and then stay to hold a dough while Nora trimmed. It continued with Cole Below the smith, who came out one evening and asked, straight out, if the talk was true that she'd found old Marrow's papers, and when she showed him the stud book he stood reading it by lantern light for an hour the way other men read scripture. "My grandfather bought a Marrow buck in '71, he said at last. Best blood he ever owned. The creamery said the line was fevered." He looked up. The creamery said a lot of things. "The creamery is Harlan Dace," Nora said. "The creamery is Harlan Dace," Cole agreed, and neither of them needed to say the next sentence aloud, the partner, the one the valley knows. Word travels a valley like water down a ditch. By the time the first snow came, half of Marble Hollow knew that the widow had found Marrow's money and Marrow's book, and, this is the part that mattered, that she had spent the money not on a train ticket but on hay and oats and 3 kidding stalls built by Tobias Finch. People do not respect luck. They respect what you do after the luck. The old woman from the auction fence came out to the farm one grey December afternoon. Her name, Nora finally learned, was Ora Pell, and she had milked for Elias Marrow in the old good years, before the diphtheria, before the betrayal. She walked the pen slow, the way Nora had walked it at the auction, and she looked at the 10 goats, sleek now, winter-coated, several of them already bred and swelling, and her seamed face did something that was almost a smile. "I told you the herd would outlive the man," Ora said. "Elias made me promise to say it to whoever came for them. I said it to every bidder for 6 years' worth of his creditors' sales." She turned. "You were the first one who bought. What were the rest waiting for?" Nora asked. "They were waiting for the goats to look like something." Ora pulled her coat tighter. "The milk remembers, girl. Come spring, you show them. Come spring." And all through that winter, through the January blizzard that drifted the lean-to to the eaves, through the February cold that froze the water pails solid twice a day, Nora Calloway carried the stud book to the fire each night and read it like a prayer book, and learned the names of every animal in it, and found, on page 214, her own 10 goats recorded as the year's last proud entry in a dying hand. If you've ever had a stranger's faith handed to you in an envelope, you know it's heavier than money. Tell me in the comments, what did you do with it? Spring came to Marble Hollow the way spring comes to the high country, all at once and overnight, the briars leafing and the snow going out of the hollow in a week of roaring creek water, and in the last week of March, the kidding began. 9 does. 14 kids. And with the kids came the milk, and with the milk came the moment the whole story had been walking toward since a cold auction pen in the rain. Nora milked the way Amos had taught her, stripped the first streams onto the tin cup, checked, then long even pulls, the pail between her knees, the barn quiet but for the rhythm of it, and the first morning she set the pans in the springhouse for the cream to rise, she came back at evening and stood looking at what had risen. She had never seen cream like it. Not on her father's place. Not anywhere. It came up a third of the depth of the pan, thick and pale gold, and when she dipped a finger it clung like custard. The stud book had claimed butterfat figures she had privately suspected were an old man's boasting. The old man had not been boasting. The Marrow line, bred 31 years for the pail, hidden 6 years under a wagon floor, had come through the winter on hay and stubbornness, and the milk remembered. She made cheese. Of course she made cheese. She had her father's apron and her father's hands and Elias Marrow's 31 years of notes, and by June she had her first small wheels of Tommy aging in Adeline Bryce's cellar, and she was selling milk to the neighbors at 4 cents a quart when the creamery paid 2 for cow's milk, and the neighbors paid it gladly, and came back with their pails, and told their brothers. And then the dairy farmers started coming. You have to picture it. Men who milked cows for a living, hard practical men, began driving wagons out to the Bryce place to taste goat's milk, because word had gone up and down the valley that the widow's herd was testing richer than anything the county had seen since before the war, and a dairyman can smell butterfat the way a hound smells a fox. They came skeptical, every one of them. They left with their jars and their orders. By high summer there were mornings when 3 wagons waited at her gate, and Tobias Finch built her a milk stand by the road, and Ora Pell came out of retirement to help with the evening milking and was paid in full and on the first of the month, and the boy who had laughed at her gate on Sundays now worked for her on Saturdays and did not laugh. She paid off the Bryce place, bought it outright, 40 acres, from Adeline, at a fair price, with a deed in her own name, Nora Calloway. Not Mrs. Anyone. Not the widow. Her name. Harlan Dace came in August. He came the way powerful men come when their power has sprung a leak, alone, affable, hat in hand, a smile arranged on his face like merchandise in a window. His creamery had lost a dozen suppliers that summer. Nobody's milk was leaving the valley, exactly, but everybody's eye had been opened, and farmers were asking prices and questions they had never asked before, and the word Marrow was being spoken again in a tone it had not been spoken in since 1884. He offered to buy the herd. He offered $100, which tells you he still thought he was dealing with the girl from the auction, and when she declined without a flicker, he offered $600, which tells you he knew exactly what the herd was. Nora stood in her barn door in her father's apron and let him finish every word, and then she said, "The herd is not for sale. Neither is the book." Dace's smile moved a little. "That book," he said, "is estate property, Mrs. Calloway. Elias Marrow died owing money, and what's found under a dead man's floorboards was left," Nora said, "in a sealed letter, addressed to whoever found it, with the debts of the estate discharged by the county sale at which I paid $300, more than any other bidder, including you." She had done her own homework, the way her father taught her to read wood before she struck it. "It's mine the way the milk is mine, Mr. Dace. Buy patience." There it was, not an accusation, nothing he could answer in a lawyer's voice, and somehow worse for that. Because a week earlier, at the county fair, Ora Pell had stood by Nora's cheese table, the table with the blue ribbon on it, the first Marrow ribbon hung in 9 years, and had told anyone who stopped exactly why the line had vanished in 1884, and who had told the creamery the milk was fevered, and whose partner he had been. She named no name. She didn't have to. The valley had always known. It had only been waiting for someone to make it worth saying aloud. Nothing happened to Harlan Dace. That is the truth of it, and I won't dress it up. No sheriff came, no court Saturday. But his creamery's receipts tell the rest of the story. By the next spring, 2 of every 3 dairy farms in the Hollow had switched their trade to the little cooperative that grew up around the widow's milk stand, and the creamery that had once set every price in the valley set prices nobody came to hear. He was not destroyed. He was simply made unnecessary, which to a man like Harlan Dace was the same wound, deeper cut. And Silas Calloway, the brother of the ledger, wrote her once a careful letter suggesting that family might invest in her evident success. Nora read it standing at the milk stand, folded it once, and wrote 4 words on the back of the envelope before returning it. "This account is settled." She never heard from him again. She never needed to raise her voice at either one of them. The reckoning in this valley did not come with shouting. It came with pails, lined up at her gate at dawn. 1 year. The title of this story promised you 1 year, and here is what 1 year built. It is a spring evening now, 1894, and the Bryce place. Nobody calls it that anymore. The deed says Nora Calloway and the painted sign at the gate says Marrow Line Farm, because she said the name belonged to the herd and not to her. The farm stands white-fenced and broom-swept at the head of the hollow. 3 kidding stalls have become a real barn. The lean-to is a milking shed with a swept plank floor. The old Marrow wagon, its floor screwed back down over the empty cedar chest, stands painted and sound, and makes a delivery run into town every morning now, driven by the boy who used to laugh at the gate. The herd numbers 26. Every doe goes back in the stud book to the 12 animals in a muddy auction pen, the $300 herd, the skeletons, the widow's folly, and the book itself lies open on a desk in the house, its pages now continued in a second hand, rounder and younger, recording births and breedings and butterfat in the same sloping columns as the old man who founded it all in 1856. The milk goes out at dawn. The farmers come with their pails and their standing orders, and on Saturdays there is a line at the milk stand, dairy farmers among them, men who keep cows and know exactly what they're looking at when they lift a jar of Marrow-line milk to the light. Her days have a rhythm now, the kind a person builds only after the storm has passed. Coffee on the porch step before first milking, in the dark, the herd's bells waking one by one along the pasture. Or a Pell arriving with the sun for the evening milking, and paying herself the compliment of never once saying I told you so, because she already told her, at a fence line, in the rain. Adeline's basket on Saturdays, no longer called leftover. Cole Below's mule standing patient while she trims, the ledger between them long since turned into friendship kept, as such men keep it, in acts and not in words. And on the first of every month, Nora Calloway does one more thing. She walks to the fence line at the top of the pasture, where small white stone stands that she paid to have cut and set over the ridge where the county buried him, and she reads the stone, Elias Marrow, 1831 to 1893. The milk remembers, and she tells him the count. 26, this month. 29, come fall. It is full dusk now, and the evening milking is done, and Nora sits on the porch step with the last light going out of the hollow, and in her two hands she holds two small things. In her right hand, on its braided cord, the brass bell her father forged, the curled N, the bell for her first lead doe, which hangs now around Sorrel's red neck and leads 26 animals home at evening. A herd follows a bell. He gave her the skill, and the hands, and the way of reading the world, the eye that saw, in a pen of dying skeletons, the straight level backs and the deep dairy wedge of something worth saving. Everything she is standing on, he built into her, 14 years in a stone cabin with a copper kettle. In her left hand, worn smooth and painted red, a child's carved wooden goat, held until the paint went soft by a girl named Rose, who died at 9 in 1884, and hidden under a floorboard by a father who never came back from that grave. He gave her the herd, and the book, and the trust of a stranger who had lost everything and still believed that somewhere, someday, there would be hands patient enough to find what he hid. The milk remembers. It did. It does. 2 dead men. 2 gifts. One taught her how to see. The other gave her something worth seeing. She was 23 years old, and she had been settled out of her husband's estate with exactly $300 to her name, and she had spent every cent of it, every single cent, on 12 dying goats that a room full of men laughed at. Sit with that tonight, the next time the whole room is laughing at the thing your eye keeps returning to. Sit with it, and ask yourself what the milk remembers in your own life, what true thing persists, underneath what everyone else has decided to forget. Thank you for staying with us for this story of patience and inheritance. If you were moved by Nora's journey, please give this video a like, and share it with someone who's ever been counted out with the whole room watching. And tell us in the comments, what have you found value in that everyone else dismissed? What did you carry out of the hardest chapter of your life, down at the bottom of your bag, against your heart? We read every single one. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell, so you won't miss our next tale. Next time, the story of a penniless riverman's daughter and the wrecked steamboat nobody would insure, and what she found in the captain's locked safe at the bottom of the Missouri. Until then, be well. And remember, the world is full of things that look like bones to everyone but you. Buy the goats.